Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Elayna with Napa Bookmine, here with Ash Davidson, author of Damnation Spring, which comes out in paperback tomorrow and is still available in hardcover. We have both if you're interested. Ash was born in Arcata and attended the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her work has been supported by the Arizona Commission on the Arts in McDowell, and she lives in Flagstaff, Arizona, although she is Zooming to us, I believe, from Marin County tonight, so not too far from us. So thanks so much for joining us this evening, Ash. I thought we would start with a little reading so we can sort of get in the mood. Does that sound good?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I was so lucky to visit Napa Bookmine back in August, and Elayna, thank you for your incredible support of Damnation Spring even before it was published. So it's a pleasure to be with you even virtually, and thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night. So maybe I'll just introduce the book quickly, is that okay, Elayna? Okay, so Damnation Spring is the story of a very tall logger named Rich Gunderson, who's obsessed with a very tall tree, a redwood tree called the 24/7 tree. This is a tree that's taller than the Statue of Liberty. It's wide enough to drive a car through. And he's inherited this sort of family obsession with owning and falling this tree. And that obsession puts him in direct conflict with his wife, Colleen, who's a homemaker and a midwife who, through her work and what she's experiencing in her own body, begins to suspect that herbicides that the logging industry is using might be poisoning their community. And that suspicion turns out to be really corrosive. It opens up a rift in her marriage. It exposes sort of disagreements within her own family and all these sort of rifts that are underlying their entire community, and everyone has to choose a side. And so I'm going to read a passage from early in the book when Colleen has arranged to go with her younger sister Enid, who has 6 kids, down to the clinic. Where they live in Klamath, there isn't medical care available, so they drive down to Arcata to a clinic that the logging company offers to its employees. And Colleen's sister needs the immunization records for her children to be able to enroll in school that year. And Colleen has arranged to drive down with her sister to get them, except that her sister isn't at the rendezvous point. And so she drives out to her sister's to find out what's happened. And this is what she finds when she gets there. And I think all you need to know going in is that Colleen is the midwife, Enid is her sister, and Colleen has a little boy, Chubb, who's 5 when the book opens, and he's in the truck with her when she drives out. So here we go. The rifle wasn't the first thing she noticed when she bounced down Enid's muddy driveway. What she noticed was Tice Whelan's tow truck, gleaming black with its bright blue hook. She set the parking brake, Chubb's cue to undo his seatbelt. And before she could register the rifle Enid held loosely at her side, a crutch too short to lean on, Chubb was scampering across the yard, hopping the creek, and disappearing up the steps into the trailer house. Growing up past the last telephone pole, Enid had always sworn she'd moved down south, beyond where the redwood curtain parted, someplace you could buy a hot dog on the street at midnight, or one of those big doughy pretzels that look like it should hang on a door like a Christmas wreath. But here she was, way out Lost Road. She had a telephone that worked half the time when she paid the bill and a tree hadn't fallen on the line. But otherwise, it was about as far from San Francisco as you could get. Tice Whelan didn't appear to have noticed the rifle yet either. He crouched, fitting a tow trap around the front wheel of her sister's new Wagoneer, red with veneered side panels. "You're making us late," Colleen said, as though Enid could hear her through the windshield. The runaway roses were blooming, pulling down the fence meant to pen the climbing goats, who balanced in the branches of their tree, watching Tice Whelan work. Colleen's mother's old Mercury was a mound of blackberry brambles, unrecognizable except for a side mirror that hung limply, like the fin of a lethargic fish. She knew she should get out of the truck before Enid did something stupid, but first she wanted an apology. They'd agreed to meet at the beehive, but this morning Colleen had found the gravel lot empty, except for the sweet scent of the blackberry bear claws Dot pulled from the bakery's oven. Colleen had even gone inside to check. "Sorry, hon, haven't seen her. You want some coffee while you wait?" Dot had asked, circles of rouge making her look like an overheated doll in her sequin sweater, her hair a platinum beehive. She'd been a beauty queen young. Miss Sanderson Timber, Miss Delnort County, Miss Redwood Country, sweet as sugar and slower than molasses, Colleen's mom used to say. Next, Colleen had driven up to the turnout where Mill Road met the highway, the way Enid would have to come. She left a hole in her crossword, clue stuck like a kernel in her teeth. Desires, 4 letters, loves, wants, needs. She couldn't make anything fit. She'd picked at it the whole way, past Rich's pickup lined up in the mill lot with the others, out No Name Road, gravel popping against the truck's underbelly, past Damnation Grove and down the steep hump onto Lost Road. And now here was her sister holding the repo man at gunpoint. Colleen sighed. Getting upset at Enid wouldn't change her. She closed her eyes, wishing she could open them and see the yard tidy. No Tice, no tow truck. Enid raised the rifle. 31 years old, and still here was Colleen, trying to keep trouble from crashing down around her little sister. Colleen climbed out. "Hi, Tice," she said. "Don't talk to him," Enid snapped. The Whelan twins were identical, down to the rat tail Tice wore at the back of his shaggy hair. But Colleen could tell him apart from Lyle, who worked as a bucker on Rich's logging crew, by the topless mermaid tattooed on his neck. The only marks Rich had on his body were scars, decades worth of nicks and gashes, hard white lines of healed skin, like the skeleton of a fish on the inside of his forearm, where he'd been cut to the bone as a teenager, sewn up, and sent right back out to work. "Take those things off," Enid ordered Tice, who was already securing the second trap. Enid's blue eyes flashed. Enid, "Stay out of it, Colleen. I mailed the check." Tice Whelan went around to the other side of the wagoneer. "Whelan, I swear to God." Colleen felt the slide of the bolt in her chest. "Don't make me shoot you between your damn eyes," Enid threatened. "You gonna load that thing first?" Tice asked. Enid checked the empty chamber, choked up on the barrel, and started toward him. "I'll bash your skull in and eat your brain with a spoon." Tice backed up. He was used to having guns pointed at him, but the stock was oak, and though he was missing an eye tooth, he still had a good straight nose. I think I'll leave it there. So hopefully that gives you a sense of Colleen, who's careful and responsible, and her sister Enid, who's a little bit of a stick of dynamite.
Thank you so much, Ash, for reading that. So I have some questions for you, and feel free to ramble if there's anything that comes up that you really want to chat about. I absolutely love listening to authors talk about their work. Everybody has a different process. Everybody goes about it in a different way, and it's really, really interesting to hear from you how you crafted the experience of the book that we are reading. So with that in mind, I am curious. So obviously you grew up in Arcata, so this was part of your history, right? This is something that you had some knowledge of growing up, or was it not really something that was discussed at all? And if it wasn't, what gave you the idea to start really digging into it for this novel?
So thank you for the invitation to ramble. I feel like I'm a natural rambler, so I feel like I'm in my element. Thank you. So my family actually lived in Klamath, which is about an hour north of Arcata at the mouth of the Klamath River. And it was a very small community when they moved there in the 70s. It's even smaller today because of the contraction of the logging industry. And we left when I was 3. And so I sort of grew up loving a place through my parents' stories that I didn't actually properly remember. I don't know if you have experiences like this of sort of family stories that have been related to you, and you feel like you can see them. You've constructed this kind of mental film roll, but really it's more your imagination assigning images to these memories than really a first person memory proper. And so I knew that I wanted to write a book set in this place because it was the most beautiful place my parents had ever lived, and that beauty was also the source of its destruction in some ways. And they had all these sort of funny stories and sad stories and stories in which they as outsiders were often the butt of the joke. And I just desperately wanted to get back to this place and wander around in it. So I built myself a time machine in the form of a novel, and I got back to an era before I was born in a town that I didn't properly remember. And I always think about this, the last page of Memory Wall by Anthony Doerr, who's probably best known for All the Light We Cannot See. So he has a beautiful collection of stories and a novella called Memory Wall. And on the very last page, there's this quote that I might get slightly wrong, but it basically says, we bury our childhood here and there. It waits for us all our lives to come back and dig it up. And I sort of felt like Klamath was there waiting for me, because even though we left when I was 3, more than 3 decades later, no one in my family drinks the water where they live. And that's a habit that started in Klamath, because my family, like Colleen and Rich in the book, lived on this stretch of land sort of hemmed between this wild Pacific Ocean and the forest. And they relied on a creek for drinking water, and that creek ran through logged land. And they became so concerned about herbicide runoff in that creek that they stopped drinking that water, although we still used it to wash our dishes and, take baths. But I was very curious about those herbicides. And so I sort of set out to investigate what had been sprayed there, why, what the health effects of that might be. And that led me to many different sort of sources and resources. And it was sort of a personal quest to want to answer that question. And no one had written the nonfiction account of this area and that issue. And so being a fiction writer, I took it upon myself to make it up.
Sometimes I think, not sometimes, a lot of the time, that there are truer truths through fiction than you can sometimes get through nonfiction. There are certain parts of the past, certain parts of our souls that we can uncover through fiction that you just don't really get to see in just a simple accounting of facts. So I love that. And I love also that you mentioned Anthony Doerr's short stories, which I'm a huge fan of as well. And not enough people know that his short stories are even better than his novels, perhaps. We often have the Shell Collector in stock at the store. So if somebody's interested in some really great short stories, please pick them up. So was since there were no nonfiction accounts, was doing research on this time period difficult for you? Did you go back and do field research, and what did that look like?
I owe a great debt to a number of people who were total strangers initially. So Californians Against Toxic Sprays gave me a list of names and phone numbers of people in the Klamath area who'd been active in the anti-spray movement. And that movement in this area in real life was largely led by Yurok and Karuk tribal members. And I think one of the most important characters in Damnation Spring is a Yurok tribal member who's also a fisheries biologist. And so I called and emailed and wrote letters, and I made 2 research trips to Klamath. And I really was very fortunate that retired loggers and mill workers and the late Yurok advocate Robley Schwenk, who was very active in the anti-spray movement, agreed to sit down and speak with me. I read a lot of newspaper articles. The loggers in this book refer to redwood trees as big pumpkins, and that's an expression that came from a newspaper article from the period. And then I was very fortunate to come across a book called A Bitter Fog by Carol Van Strum, which is a nonfiction account of a community in the coastal range of Oregon, around Five Rivers and Alsea, and Colleen's sister Enid and her husband Eugene have a daughter in the book named Alsea, who's named in honor of this community because there was a school teacher there named Bonnie Hill who noticed that women were miscarrying around the same time of year, and that correlated with spraying in the spring. And so she documented these miscarriages and she sent a letter to the EPA. And thanks to some pressure by an investigative journalist, the EPA ended up doing 2 studies, the Alsea studies 1 and 2. And that led to the emergency suspension of 2,4,5-T, which is, you might recognize as one of the active ingredients in Agent Orange, the other being 2,4-D. And 2,4,5-T was suspended for forestry use in 1979, although it was they continued to spray it on rice crops and on rangeland through the mid-1980s. And 2,4-D is still on the market. If you go to your local Walmart, to the lawn care aisle, you'll find plenty of products that have 2,4-D as an ingredient. It was sprayed on the National Mall to control dandelions in Washington, D.C. until 1980, when the Park Service banned it on all of their units. And so it's a really beautiful nonfiction account. There are a number of sort of health impacts related to 2,4,5-T use that appear in Damnation Spring that are almost all inspired by Carol's book. And so she was really generous to me in reading the book before it was published. A number of people in Klamath, especially Amy Cordalis at UROC, was really helpful. And then I think I also owe just a great debt to sort of the altruism of YouTube users. Then you can really learn a little bit about a lot of different things. And for this book, that included everything from how to harvest a deer to how to repair a chainsaw to information about midwifery and how to deliver a baby, all these skills that I hope that I'll never have occasion to use in real life, that I was able to learn a little bit about because total strangers took time to share it with the larger world. And so it was difficult to find people who'd done the actual work portrayed in the book in the time period because it's set in the late 70s. And there just are not that many people in the world who know how to fall a tree that's 15 or 20 feet in diameter and 300 feet tall.
So how long was that research process before you started writing? Or did you get the bones of the novel down, do research, more writing, more research, more writing, more research?
Oh, I could teach a very comprehensive class in the most inefficient way to write a novel. So I sort of researched and wrote concurrently for the first couple of years. And I actually had a draft very quickly. I started it in July of 2010, right before I left for the Iowa Writers Workshop. And by November, I had what I thought was a full draft. And I thought, oh, maybe this won't be so hard. And then 10 years later, the book was finalized. So I had done quite a bit of like book and newspaper research for about the first 4 years. And then in 2014, I got this research grant and I dragged my mom with me back to Klamath, just sort of thinking, well, I have my book. I just need to sort of get the sounds and the sights and the smells correct. I just thought it would be a fact-checking trip. And then I started interviewing people, and it was different than what I was reading in the sense that like I'd set out to write a book that was very focused on the herbicide spraying issue and that happened to include some loggers. But what I found when I actually went out and talked to people who'd worked in the mills and worked in the woods was that it wasn't nearly as clear cut as I had it in my novel, or what I thought was my novel, if you'll pardon the sort of the pun. But so I had this idea that it was this very clear dichotomy, you know, loggers would think this way and environmentalists would be on the other side. But when I actually asked a logger about the sprays, he shared an experience of being sprayed over while he was working and how that had affected him. And that really disrupted this very tidy narrative I constructed in my mind, because it also taught me that people who work in the woods also love the woods. You know, they spend their workday there, but they also hunt and fish and camp and take their kids berry picking and hiking. And there's a line in the book that says, if you scratch a logger, you better believe you'll find an environmentalist underneath. And I think that is something that I had to go out and actually talk to people to learn, and to remember that human beings are a lot more complicated. And by trying to simplify that narrative, I was robbing people of their humanity on both sides of the debate, and that complexity of the human condition requires a lot more nuance, and it's definitely more tweezer work than axe work.
And that actually, you just answered what my next question was going to be, which was about this nuanced portrayal of an issue that I certainly saw as black and white, starting the novel, knowing what it was about. And I think most people who pick up the book will probably come at it from one particular point of view or the other, and leave with this sense that it was much more of a gray area and still is much more of a gray area. And it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of your rewriting had to do with that was welcoming the gray into the novel and acknowledging it. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes, that should be the subtitle of the novel, Welcoming the Gray. Yeah, I think
also works for the fog.
Yes, exactly. It's very good. I should consult you on my next book for the title. Yeah, I think that really is true. And I think that, it's a book about one issue logging in one small town, but I think you could write a very similar book about, a dozen different issues, from coal mining in West Virginia to oil and gas in Wyoming, because it really is. It's a book about work in many ways, and a book about industry. And I think that we have a tendency, especially in the environmental movement, to sort of villainize the people who do that sort of work, and to think that they're somehow responsible for the environmental degradation wrought by their industry, and as if they're signing up for contaminated drinking water or cancer or any of those things. And I just don't think that's fair at all. I wrote a book that is printed on paper. It's recycled paper that's produced without chlorine, but it is still on paper. I live in a house that's made out of wood, and I think that I think that we don't always think about our own role in these industries as consumers. And I think that there is a real pride and a dignity and an identity attached to work of all kinds. So of course that's true for logging too. And I think that it made me see the issue more holistically. And in my day job, I spend time in public meetings and public hearings on a variety of environmental issues, from forestry issues to uranium mining. And when people go to the mic, it's clear that no matter what side you are on in these debates, people care about a certain number of sort of core things, and there are core values that overlap. People care about providing for their family and keeping them safe the best way that they know how, and they care about setting up their children for a different life and a better life than they have in many ways. And I think that that's something that Rich, the logger in the book, who's the fourth generation to do this work, that's something he's trying to do for his own son, Chubb, because even in the late 70s, he sees the writing on the wall that this forest won't last forever, and that his son won't be able to harvest trees like he is harvesting because they won't exist. And, at the time the book is set in the late 70s, depending who you ask, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the original 2 million acres of coastal redwoods remain. And that number today, according to the National Park Service, is about 4%. And Rich can already see this trajectory in his lifetime. And he's part of his plan to harvest the 24/7 and set his family up financially is to give his son different choices than he had as a boy that age. And I think that it is a book in a lot of ways about the type of choices that we have in life, and how where you're born and who you're born to really determines what you see as possible for yourself in your life.
And it's so interesting to me living in Napa because we are in an area that is dominated by one industry, one agricultural industry, an industry that is very strongly connected to the land and the health of the land. And I see the same debates going on within our own community about land use and water use and water safety that we see in this family, you know, in a completely different climate at the far north of our state 50, 40 years ago. These same issues are happening still in other places. And also to speak to your point as well of, you know, people, the kids who are born here, we had a young bookseller who was dead set on never getting into the wine industry, wanted to become a lawyer, and now he's like neck deep in the wine industry, having the time of his life. And it's funny because, you know, it probably wouldn't have been anything that would have occurred to him if he had grown up anywhere else. To get into this industry, I just see so many parallels. It's just so interesting to me, you know, a story like the one that you've given us, which feels so rooted, pun slightly intended, in its time, in its place, and yet also has so many parallels to all of these other times and places, just goes to show, you know, the universality of the human condition. And it's just really beautiful to be able to distill it into this one thing that we can hold in our hands and feel. Anyways, I'm rambling a bit now. You got me rambling.
Yeah, no, I think the geography of opportunity is really interesting. And I'm sure there is many great novels could be written about the wine industry in Napa and how it affects the natural world and how the natural world affects humans. And I think I've spoken with a number of student groups about the book, and it's been very interesting to speak with students who come from very conservative backgrounds, from agricultural areas. And when you start talking about clean water, everyone has an opinion and an experience to share. And it is really, you know, I came to this book with my own biases, and it really sort of, in the course of writing it, I sort of had to set my judgment aside and come from a place of non-judgment and make sure that the book didn't take sides. And I think that's something that was important. It was an important learning experience for me. And it's been really interesting to hear from readers on both sides of the issue, you know, from people who worked in the logging industry and people who trained themselves to redwoods to prevent people from falling them. And that there are, as even when people are on such diametrically opposite sides, there are these core values that are shared. So I think you are right. It's pretty universal across industries, when in any profession that has to do with the natural world and relying on a natural resource, whether it's land or an extractive industry like timber or coal.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the format of the novel, because you break it up into these different voices, and it's still third person, but we're getting it through the lens of these different characters, including Chubb, the child's voice. And was it always written that way? Did you write it over and over again from different perspectives and then decide that you had to have all of them? And what was it like getting into these people's heads, having this be your first work of fiction, especially?
Well, I had no idea what I was doing. I started with a first-person novel, an I novel, in Rich's perspective. And Rich is a 53-year-old logger working in a profession I never have. You know, my family cut firewood, but no one in my family was a logger. And so on the surface, I don't have a lot in common with him, but he walked on the page pretty much as he is in the book as you'll read it now. You know, he was a little bit younger, he was a little bit taller, but he kept banging his head on the top of doorways. So I had to shrink him a little bit because it was a little bit of a health hazard. But he's pretty much stayed the same. I realized about 2 years in that I needed another perspective, because Rich, as a man of his generation in that time, there were a lot of rooms he just couldn't walk into. You know, literally, he couldn't walk into Melody's bedroom when she's in labor. He couldn't walk into Enid's kitchen and sit down and have that sort of kitchen table discussion about the cost of diapers and what's on her mind. And so both literally and figuratively, he couldn't have access to those spaces. So I added his wife, Colleen, and she could. And so I had access to sort of to another perspective, and that sort of expanded the range of sort of the rooms the book could wander into. But Rich and Colleen are both very quiet. I think the next book I write, I'm going to write about loudmouths because it'll be a lot easier. But there were still things that I couldn't quite get at. And so I added Chubb, who's their 5-year-old son. And Chubb is, I mean, I'm biased because I invented him, but I think he's a delight. And he, you know, he's literally closer to the ground than his very tall father, and he's fully alive to the magic of the natural world. And so you get to experience the ferns over his head and the mist and the fog and water and wildlife through his point of view. And I think that I realized that Chubb could also be there in some of the most emotionally heavy scenes without being crushed by the weight of those scenes. Because he's a child, he doesn't obfuscate the way the adults around him might. He's pretty open about what he sees is what he lets you see as a reader. He's not filtering it. And so he's sort of a stand-in that allows you into spaces that Rich and Colleen might edit your access to. And I also think that what's interesting about him is that because he's a child, people will have conversations in front of him thinking they're speaking in code and that he won't understand. And I worked as a nanny in graduate school, and I saw people behave this way in front of children. And I think that people don't give children enough credit for what they pick up on. You know, yes, you can have a coded conversation and a child might not understand exactly what's going on, but children are really good at taking the emotional temperature of a room. They know when something is up, and Chubb is often there at the most difficult moment to sort of give you access to that scene, but also a little bit of distance because he's not so weighed down by what's happening emotionally that he'll share it without sort of thinking and filtering. And so I had those 3 voices. There's a 4th voice that comes later in the book, but it's much, much later. And I also, you know, wrote many of the scenes in the book. It's set over the course of a single year, from the summer of 1977 to the summer of 1978. And you get between 90 and 100 days in the book, but I wrote all 365. And some of them I wrote from more than one perspective. You know, like I'd have a whole scene in Colleen's point of view, and then there were things that she saw that Rich would have seen something different. So I wrote the whole scene in Rich's point of view. And because I'd worked really hard on them, I wanted to keep them all. And it was my editor who was like, no, this is intensely boring for a reader to have to live through the whole scene again in a second perspective. And so I had to let them go. And I had this file. It really should be called a kill file on my computer, where I would just move them. But in my mind, it was like, I'm not killing you. I'm just moving you. I can always bring you back from the dead. Like, here you are. And eventually that sort of kill file ended up with 500,000 words in it, because, you know, you labor so much on that sentence and it's absolutely perfect. And then you realize in year 8 that you don't need that sentence, and it's just really difficult to let go of. And so there was a lot of that. There was also, you know, a novel is a big beast. I'd never written one before. I'd only written short stories, which are a lot easier to fit in your brain. And so I had a bunch of continuity issues. You know, like I had a woman who was pregnant for 10 months. I had Eugene leave house in a Ford and arrive in a Chevy. I had Rich's eyes change from blue to green to blue, which is why he has blue-green eyes in the book, because I changed them so many times. And so I ended up I made myself on a little sheet of computer paper, 8.5 by 11, I made myself a little grid to try to keep track of various things, including sort of the arcs of the plot lines. And I realized that, wait, that paper wasn't big enough. So I taped another piece of paper to it. Then I taped another piece of paper to it. And now it's sort of a joke in my family, because eventually it was like a tapestry, a quilt of this, like it's the size of a full-size bed, because I needed that to keep track of everything. So I didn't know what I was getting into, and I thought it was going to be a much simpler process than it actually was. So I learned a lot in writing it. And you would think that, like, okay, you've learned all your lessons the hard way, you would know how to set yourself up for the next book, but I'm going about the next book in exactly the same way. And there's an Ayanna Mathis quote. She wrote the 12 Tribes of Hattie. I don't know if you know that book. I really love it. And I saw her speak when she was on tour for that book. And someone asked her what writing a novel had been like after writing short stories. And she said something to the effect of, like, it was searching for a black cat in a dark room. And I think of that often, because that's very much my experience. Like, I'm completely blind and I'm just feeling around and the cat keeps moving.
What a treat of a little peek inside the brain of a novelist. And I think a lesson to all of us about how hard it is to write a book. I think a lot of people don't really give it the credit that it deserves. It is very, very hard to write a novel, to write a good novel. It's a lot of work. So congratulations, kudos to you on all that work. Well done.
Thank you. I wasn't sure. There were many years where I thought the only place the book would ever live is like in a Word file on my old laptop, which had a broken Y key for the last year. So if you decide to read the book, please pay special attention to the Ys in the last 40 pages, because each of those had to be copy and pasted into the book. They were hard earned. So it's really such a pleasure to be like speaking to someone who knows these characters as I do, because I wasn't sure they would ever have a life outside that laptop.
My N key broke at the beginning of the pandemic, so I sympathize with the frustration.
Are you still copying and pasting it in?
Oh, I was copying, and I work for a bookstore that has 2 N's in our name, one uppercase and one lowercase. Oh, it was a real pain, let me tell you. So I think probably now would be a good time if anybody wanted to put yourself on camera, take yourself off mute, chat with us, ask Ash some questions. I know Marianne might join us again to talk about Humboldt. While you all are thinking about that, I do have one of our, a good customer who has been shopping with us from the beginning of the bookstore almost 9 years ago, also grew up in Humboldt, and she has been buying this book to gift to people. And so my boss, who's at the store right now, made sure that I mention this to you because she loves it. And she says it really reminds her of Humboldt and home. So well done on that.
Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
So you did, I mean, you briefly mentioned you're working on another novel. Can you tell us anything about it?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel about a family of wildland firefighters. So, I work at a desk job from 8 to 5. And so I get up at 5 in the morning to write before work. And so if I set the book outside, at least I get to spend time in the forest for 3 hours before work. So that's my strategy on this one also. And like, I did all this chainsaw research, and there are also chainsaws in wildland firefighting. So I feel like
you've got to put it to use. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure, as you know, we have issues with wildfires here in Napa and in neighboring Sonoma County. So I know that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be very interested to read that. It's something, that has been a part of our natural environment now for about 5 plus 6 years-ish. We're hoping that our wet April is maybe going to tamp that down, but who knows? Who knows?
Oh, I hope so.
So who do you want to read Damnation Spring the most, and why?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I think the people I was most nervous about reading it are people who are from the area, who know the industry and who know the issue. And that fear has so far proved to be unfounded. I've heard from a lot of former loggers and mill workers and from people in the environmental movement who have said, I don't think it's changed anyone's mind, but people have said that it takes them back to that time, and that it, like, they remember living in that sort of atmosphere. And I think that I guess if I could choose someone to read the book, I would probably choose someone who hasn't been to the Redwoods, because I hope that they'll go, or at the very least Google them, because it's so, there's an epigraph at the beginning of the book from Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck that says they're not like any trees we know. And that's from this longer passage that talks about the Redwoods and says that no one has ever successfully painted or photographed a redwood tree. And I do think it's like that could be extended to fiction too. It's very difficult to capture that experience if you haven't had it. And I think here in California, many people do know that feeling of walking into the redwoods and sort of the quality of the light, that greenish tint of light filtering down through the canopy, and sort of the hush and the quiet of that environment, and how it is kind of like entering a library or a cathedral. Like, people just instinctively lower the volume of their voices. And it's sort of difficult to imagine how small you are in the world until you're standing next to a redwood tree. And I think in a world that's loud and very, in a culture that's very individualist and consumer driven, there's some real value in sort of the quiet and the sort of feeling of being a speck in the universe that you get in the redwoods. So I hope it'll inspire people who haven't had the opportunity to go there to at least Google them and maybe someday see these forests for themselves. And I also hope, we're living in a time that's very polarized politically. And I think that wherever you stand on issues of environmental regulation, I would hope that it's a book that might make you think about why there are people who see those issues differently than you do, who might vote differently than you do, and to recognize some shared humanity there, and that people are trying to take care of the people they love and use the skills that they have to guarantee their children, the safest and the best life that they can. And there are different ways of conceiving that. So that's sort of a broad audience. Maybe I don't know that I answered your question.
So everybody.
Well, yes.
I did not grow up in Humboldt, but I did grow up in Marin, about a 15-20 minute drive from your woods. And it is truly an otherworldly place. I mean, I think now, they have shuttles. You can't even park down there anymore because it's so busy. You have to make a reservation and buy tickets. But when I grew up there in the 80s and 90s, it was not necessarily hidden, it was still a national monument. People knew it was there, but, you could just drive down there on a Saturday morning, park right outside in the little parking lot and just wander through the redwoods. And you'd always see, young families, kids running through these giant holes in the redwoods there. And it is truly an experience that is not really like anything else that I've ever come across in the natural world before. I've never made it up to Humboldt. I'm going to have to. There's Marianne, who grew up in Humboldt, if I recall correctly.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, you just lived there for a long time.
My working life, my career was there. I grew up in Iowa. Didn't I hear something about Iowa at the beginning of this?
Yes, where in Iowa did you grow up?
Well, I went to school in Iowa City.
Oh, I lived in Iowa City for 4 years. It's such a nice
I
town.
had a roommate who was in the writing project ages ago. But I wanted to say, I think I'm going to buy your book. And the reason is that you do have this point of view, which I have found in my own life, of that human beings have complications, And my husband and I worked in Eureka on the Citizens for Clean Air. We founded the Citizens for Clean Air, so it was a different environmental cause that ended up with his running for city council and trying to get somebody to work for the county who would evaluate the pollution from the pulp mills, which was another issue that you think everybody's going to be on one side or the other, but of course they aren't, because if you live there, you're aware of the problems and you're aware of both sides. So anyway, and I wanted to say 2 years ago, I went up to Patrick's Point. And what I remember is sitting there and looking at trees that were so healthy, that we don't have trees that healthy very many places. And they're still really beautiful and healthy, and you can just sit among them and enjoy. And the other thing I did, my husband and I were at the dedication of the Lady Bird Johnson Grove in the Redwood National Park. And that was an amazing time and that was another thing we worked on, was to try to get the Redwood Park National Park. So congratulations. I'm impressed.
Thank you. It's so what an amazing historical moment to have been at. And I think that what really surprised me going back even now is I live about an hour and a half from the Grand Canyon, which is just absolutely overrun by tourists. And so I've been very struck at, there's a lot of visitation to Redwood National Park, about 500,000 people a year. But if you go just a little bit north to Del Norte County, the Redwood State Parks are at many times of year virtually empty, to the point that the first time as an adult that I was hiking there, I was a little bit spooked by it, because you can't go anywhere in the Grand Canyon without running into tons of people, and you can hike for hours in the state parks without running into anyone. And the trails are just magnificent, and it's so heartening to see the natural world kind of thrive without us, I think. And I think there's so much sort of, I don't know what you call it, despair maybe around climate change in this moment, and to see some of the research coming out of the redwoods and the resilience of these forests, even in the face of fire, in the face of drought, is really heartening. And it's just such a beautiful part of the world, and so little traveled.
I imagine Jedediah Smith State Park.
Of course. Favorite family picnic spot. Yes,
we camped there numerous times, and such a wonderful place.
Absolutely stunning. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne. I now know what I'm going to do for my next vacation.
You have to go hike the Damnation Creek Trail. It's spectacular.
I will have to do that. And I know that I'm going to have to call on you two for recommendations on where to go.
Yeah, Prairie Creek is a good place to start. Go to Fern Canyon, walk to the ocean through Prairie Creek. Have you done that, Ash?
That would be my top recommendation of a hike. I think actually scenes from Jurassic Park were filmed in Fern Canyon, because the forest is just so lush and amazing. Do ask the rangers about whether the footbridges are open.
Right. Wonderful footbridges.
Good tip. Okay.
I remember one, there's even a wonderful inscription on it, which I can't remember, I'm ashamed to say, but I remember reading it and being really pleased that it was done in the middle of the forest.
Something to go find.
Yeah, something to find.
Amazing. Well, if nobody else has any questions, Ash, is there anything you'd like to end this conversation on this evening?
I just want to thank you for spending your Monday night here with me, and thank you, Elayna, for inviting me. And I know there are a lot of books in the world, so thank you for choosing mine. And thank you. You know, independent bookstores are such sort of beating hearts of literary communities across the country, and especially for a newbie like me, a beginning writer. I don't think I really understood the power of the independent bookseller and the hand sell, and how much, if you are an unknown writer, you rely on word of mouth and the recommendations of booksellers. So thank you so much for your support. It really means the world to me.
Well, thank you, Ash. Again, Damnation Spring. We do have a few hardcovers left, but it's also out in paperback tomorrow. So congrats on that. The cover on that paperback is really stunning as well. And definitely tells a bit more of what the story is about. So I think they made a good, not that I don't love this cover, it is because it's gorgeous, but it hooks you in a little bit more. So we have both at pretty much all three of our stores, I believe, or we have hardcovers, I think, just at the Pearl Street shop, paperbacks at all of them. Ash, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope that we'll see you for your next book, maybe, when it comes out in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, 2032. Maybe we'll cross paths in the redwoods before then.
Perfect. I can't wait. Well, thank you all so much. Hope you have a lovely evening. Good night.
Good night.